to our session, which is called Sparking Trams, Silenced Rails, a journey through European Tramscapes. And from the last session, which went very kind of high to the spiritual levels, we're now moving back to earth and on a very street level and on the level of everyday life. Our session will lead you on a journey into the past and present landscape of European cities. There will be 4 of us talking or performing today. We have here Jason Finch, who is Associate Professor of English Language and Literature here at ABOAGORA. And then we have Tonio Weicker, who is a postdoctoral researcher from Germany, the Leibniz Institute for Regional Geography. And then we have Aleksandra Ianchenko, and she's an artist, and doctoral students both at the universities of Tallinn University and the ABOAGORA University. We have understood fire as both concrete and symbolic. Questions of transport are always related to fire, if we understand fire as energy, well, sometimes more openly, sometimes more disguised, but often disputed. We will be concentrating on the symbolic, rather, here. Trams and tramways have a very special place in European urbanity, and they have been firing up the urban imaginations since the late 19th century. And from early on, trams have not been mere vehicles, but also icons of modernity and urban mobility that have been depicted and narrated in postcards, films, literature, and other urban imagery, maybe more than any other kind of public urban transport. You can disagree if you want, but that's my opinion. We have been researching the manifold dimensions of public transport in a multidisciplinary project titled Public Transport as Public Space in European Cities. Okay, sorry. Now, Malla, can you help me with the slides, please? Okay, here we go again. So, we have been researching the manifold dimensions of public transport in our multidisciplinary research project titled Public Transport as Public Space in European Cities, Narrating, Experiencing, Contesting. Today, we will give you a glimpse about what we have been working with in Turku, Tallinn, London, Berlin, and we go all the way to Kazakhstan, which is not geographically Europe, I think, but you will soon hear more about that. Our collective aim has been to give a counter voice of the often economic and technology-driven discourses, and to look at the public transport as a culturally and historically formed space. How people remember and how they narrate the past and imagine the future is important, because anything new always has to be imagined first. We want to argue and remind that public transport consists of public spaces. They might not be traditional kind of public spaces such as squares or streets or marketplaces. Public transport is a space which has a very special kind of entanglements of human experience, technology, and mobility. Here, just a quick slide of our projects and the multiple things we are working with, because we were only a small group here. Today, we couldn't bring us all in, unfortunately. So encounters in public transport are often involuntary, but at the same time, they are dense, intense. In public transport, we can see, smell, hear, and sense people at close distance, which has created specific kinds of public cultures and public behaviors. Public transport in European cities have similar and recognizable features, but cities also have an atmosphere of their own. Urban citizenship and urban identity are connected to urban transport, which is unique in every city. Public transport studies also raise questions of inclusion in and exclusion from the society. Ticket controls, for example, sometimes become migration controls and can be devastating for the paperless people. Public transport passengers encounter every day kind of multiculturalism if they use public transport. In Richard Sennett's words, city is a place where we can meet the other, or where we can see the other. But to extend the idea a little bit further, a bus, a metro, a tram can also be a place where we can smell, hear, and sense other kind of people. Traveling in a tram can, for example, be a very rich linguistic experience where we can hear different languages, different dialects that we don't hear or see in the mainstream media or our other daily surroundings. So public transport has the capacity to bring together diversities. But also racism is something that becomes very tangible and concrete in public transport. Thus, questions of justice are at the core when transport is studied as a public phenomenon. Okay, that was the introduction to our projects and our kind of common aims, what we have been doing, and now we'll go to more specific cities with these questions in mind. My own part has been the tram history, or rather the cultural memory of trams and tramways in our city, Turku, or Åbo in Swedish. So those of you who are not familiar with it, Turku has a history of trams, and the first tram opened in 1890, and the first electric tram in 1908. And the heyday of the golden era of trams was in the 50s. The extent of the tramline network reached its peak in the late 1950s, but the first tram cars were replaced by buses in 1967, and then the tram lines closed down one by one. The last tram rode in 1972. The political decisions leading to the closing have been an ongoing interest for local historians and enthusiasts, activists. So the political history, as well as the planning history of the Turku Ham, has been, in a way, written, debated by writers like Mikko Laaksonen, and it is often discussed. Now, I think it's daily discussed in media and in very lively social media platforms. In the framework of our project, I have, however, tried to expand from the political debates to the kind of passenger experience and the cultural dimension, and approach the tram as a lived space of everyday life that has cultural dimensions outside the political. In the historiography of public transport, the closing of the tram marked an era, or the closing of an era in the city. The closing paved way to buses, but above all, private cars and driving. And the amount of cars has continued to increase. The closing down, however, was not ever total. Many traces of the trams could be seen in the city space years afterwards. Here is an image from Martinmäki from 1974, 2 years after the closing, and here we can still see the rails on the road. And in Turku, the tram has an important part in the urban cultural memory, which means that memory itself is an active part in the self-image of the urban identity, which means that whether the current council votes for the building of a new tram or not, the idea will not go away easily. Image of the tram has become also a consumer product, as you can see in this image, and I myself have bought these printed images of Turku tram and given them to gifts to people in Turku and outside. And this is, of course, one way to keeping the memory alive. Every European city has its own public transport history, which gives the city its character, I argue. But public transportation is also very personal. The experiences and memories of traveling, but also waiting, sitting, standing in the rain, all these sensory memories, they shape our lives and our memories of the city. And also the traveling routes can be embedded in our memories as kind of personal geographies that we have. I sometimes travel in my dreams with buses that don't exist anymore. Knowing and being able to use public transport creates agency, a feeling of belonging. Historical imagination is about the capacity to imagine other past times and places. And the concept of cultural memory has been a very popular concept to analyze the various ways the past and present are interconnected. So building the tram is in Turku a hot issue, and the memory of the history of the tram is constantly in discussion. And this is why I think it is very important that we pay attention in which way we use the history and which way we talk about it. When searching for sources for studying the everyday history of tram traveling, I was struck by the amount of images and pictures and photos. It seems that the tram has been a hugely popular leitmotif in urban photography. These days, the photos are circulated in social media platforms so that anyone interested in the topic has seen these images like hundreds, if not thousands of times. The photos revive memories, and I would argue that they have a possibility to deepen the sense of place and belonging. But old trams are often framed in the discourse of nostalgia. Nostalgia itself can, of course, be used in many ways. It can sometimes distance the members from the debates of the daily politics, but on the other side, they can also strengthen the community, or at least bring people together. The cultural memory of Turku tram is at once European and very local. Giada Peterle, an Italian cultural geographer and comic artist, visited our project briefly. And she understood quite quickly the kind of basic lines and the basic narratives and stories of the Turku tram. How its traces can be seen in the current urban landscape, in the way people talk about it, in the way it's nostalgized in souvenirs, and so on. So this story is not unique for Turku. Trams have been closed down in many European cities, especially in Western Europe. And the stories and feelings of the closing, they bear resemblance to one another. But these images here, which are from Giada's comic book, they also tell that there is something very unique and personal also here. The nostalgia for the tram started to emerge soon after the last line closed in 1972. Although the festivities were not very grand. You see the small, tiny flowers there in front of the tram. That is as much as the Turku people celebrated the event in other European cities, such as in London, they had much more grandiose festivities. Studying experiences from inside the tram is somewhat challenging, and one of the reasons is simply that although there is this plethora of pictures and images, most of them are taken from the outside. Interviews and oral memory can of course be used, but there are some problems here. And one simple is the one that there is 50 years behind us, between us. So when people start to talk about their tram memories, they often talk about the time when they were young or when they were children. But there are, of course, many different age groups always using the public transport, and that is the one that is hard to get from interviews these days. So I will end with a letter from the past. It's written by an anonymous elderly person from Turku who wished not to be forgotten. I found the letter in a cardboard box at the archives at Föli, the Turku region traffic office. The card box, it contains feedback sent by the citizens of the city. And in 1950s and 60s and up till the 90s, the feedback was usually sent to the office, often directly to the director, who also answered them in person and signed them all, which I think it's amazing, and it tells a lot about the society in kind of two ways, both about, there is a great sense of duty with the civil servants in traffic office of the time by answering them so in detail and so. But it tells also a lot about the trust that people in the city had for the authorities. But this letter here is anonymous, so there is no name or no address and no answer to that. But I want to read it to you anyways. Dear Tram, you were the only one in the city of Turku who remembered us, the elderly, and who drove us steadily and didn't throw us around. Even I, 80 years old, walking with a cane, could get safely inside. But it's different now. When I enter the yellow danger, the name is very apt, it is not at all sure how it works out. If one gets inside, the benches are all funny, some almost hitting the ceiling, others on the floor level. Why is that? You, the tram, you remembered us, but could not resist the big masters. The death sentences are given by those in power. They drive with their own cars and pollute the air. They never enter the yellow danger. It must be fun to take away even that little thing from the elderly when you yourself, you have it all. But thank you all the drivers and conductresses who took me safely home. You who have the power, do not forget us elderly. I am so old that I will not be around here for long, but you too will get old one day, and maybe then you will think differently. Farewell, the dearest number 3. In my heart, I will always remember you. Okay, maybe I'll end here and let Jason lead you through the... I'll let Tonio lead you to Berlin Trams and wherever they will go.
Yeah, hello. I'm very happy to be here. Yeah, so remembering trams and now switching to traveling with trams and what happens when trams travel the world. Of course, you can only remember something when it's already gone. And maybe some of you ask yourself at times what happens to trams when once they are not providing their services in the cities. And we are going to trace this today a bit. So what I'm going to talk about is a rather overlooked phenomenon, namely about trams which travel the world. Fascinated by the way how tram vehicles adapt to different environments and how they build up new networks, how they change when going to other cities. This talk is, I would say, more an irritation or to reimagine European tramscapes, because European tram landscapes are not only Western cities and modern green trams that are the solution for our cities, but European trams, you can find them also in Kazakh cities, for instance. So it is an attempt to somehow widen the perception of trams as a frictionless technological fix in European cities, and it tries to point at a seemingly invisible side effect of urban transport modernization. So, however, what is often left out in this green narrative, in this new renaissance of trams, is that these fancy low-floor tram technologies, they are often replacing solidly working tram systems in a city, which in consequence then have to be sold, or sometimes they are used as stores or maybe as a kiosk, but often they are sold to other cities. So one could say trams actually do immigrate. They travel away from accessibility requirements, technology standards, which they are no longer able to meet. So, very much in contrast to what we just heard, how trams are like an iconic image of a city. They are actually not as stable as we might think. So they are connected to one city. So of course they are something that we observe in our everyday life, but they do not stay forever. They serve in a city for surprisingly short time spans, at least in German cities where we did our little research here. We traced 4,702 tram cars that actually traveled the world from Germany to all other kinds of cities, mostly to the east, mostly to post-Soviet cities. So they go from Berlin to Pyongyang in North Korea, from Schwerin to Vladikavkaz in Russia, from Ulm to Arad in Romania, for instance. But what is actually much more interesting is to have a closer look on the individual tram biographies, and that's why I want to introduce you to the fabulous life of Tatra KT4DTM 883005, which indeed has an incredible life for already 38 years in operation, manufactured in Prague, the famous Tatra factory of Prague, which delivered for the German supply the Tatra 88305 to East Berlin, where it started its services in 1983. And continued after several modernizations in the city of Bautzen and Berlin, was taken over finally after the unification in Western Berlin from transport provider BYG, who also then had huge discussions about Tatras, whether they want to leave the Tatras in the city or not. And then first they had a huge modernization program of Tatras that also affected our Tatra 88305, as you can see on the third picture, just got a new color in 1995. However, in 1997, the decision was made to purchase streetcars from Bombardier, which were providing better equipment and better standards. So the days of Tatras in Berlin were actually counted. However, it took another 5 or 6 years until Tatra 88305 was sold to Almaty in Kazakhstan, the former capital, where it then provided services under the number 1011. And in 2007, then, the tram wagon went out of service and was temporarily used as a kiosk just next to the tram depot for transport workers. However, that's not the end of the stories, because in 2018, the city government of Ust-Kamenogorsk in East Kazakhstan decided to build and maintain and renovate the tram. It again got a new color and traveled again hundreds of kilometers and is since then in operation until present days. And as you can imagine, there are hundreds and thousands of stories like the one of Tatra 88305. And what's so interesting about it, well, I would say so there's this struggle between maintenance and modernization, and that is maybe where I also see the fire in it, so that there's always the final decision to sell trams to other places, or to stay with them, and to what needs passion for the remont, for the renovation work that is done. The individual knowledge that needs to be put into the renovation of trams at places. However, of course, don't get me wrong, I'm not arguing against the importance of better accessibility to public transport vehicles, but some cities have much more creative attempts to it. So, for instance, the city of Leipzig is simply combining. They decided to stay with the Tatra trams, and they have like a second streetcar, which then is a low-floor car, which provides for better accessibility. While others have just majorly rebuilt the material setting of the tram. So, would just sum up and also give then the hand over to Jason. When we look on second-hand tram geographies, of course there's a critical point to make, right? Of course there is the question, why are these non-inclusive, outdated trams good enough for Eastern European cities and not for German ones? And indeed, if transport activists in these cities, they criticize this decision with all the rights, and they claim that, of course, one major intent of Western public transport operators is to get rid of the responsibility to scrap them in a sustainable manner. So these Western donations are not so much of a donation in the end. And that's, of course, important when thinking about the revival of trams in the global north on a general note, and these decarbonized futures that have side effects elsewhere in the world. But on a general note, there's also another different story to tell, right? And I was already hinting to that. There's this incredible life of 40, 50 years that such a tram is in operation. And the passionate work of mechanics and drivers and enthusiasts maintaining tram vehicles in very different cities. And maybe it is time to appreciate this kind of work that is actually a lived maintenance culture. And that is also where I want to stop and really give the credits to transport enthusiasts around the world, and especially the Russian-speaking ones that helped us to also do this little mapping. We wouldn't be able to really validate our data that we have found without many people who trace streetcars and tram wagons and tram technology and discuss pro and cons of the better technology and give advice to engineers and drivers how to deal with certain systems. And so this is really impressive and a really super interesting citizen science project in the end. And with this, I would hand over to you, Jason.
Hello. Today I'll talk to you about the tramways of London. And in 2000, something called the Croydon Tram Link began operating in suburban South London. This light railway, partly running on streets, still works today as part of Transport for London's public transport network, alongside London's much more famous buses and underground trains. But I won't talk about Croydon Tram Link today. Instead, I'll talk about London's original tramway, which operated from 1870 to 1952. In the 1920s, London had the biggest tram network in Europe. However, by 1952, London's tramways had entirely closed down. The rails were torn up or asphalted over, and the older trams themselves were burnt and melted down for scrap. The newest trams were sold to British cities such as Leeds, which themselves ended tram operation in the next 15 years or so. None of the London trams were repurposed outside the UK, as far as I know. In the 20th century, people used to talk about mass media, including the newspapers and radio broadcasting. Today, we often hear about mainstream media as a contrast with unofficial networks sharing information or opinion. And I'll say a little bit about cinema newsreel as a kind of 20th century mainstream or mass media. Whichever label we apply, if depictions such as those of cinema newsreel are to be believed, the disappearance of London's original tramway in 1952 aroused instant nostalgia, but not much in the way of actual resistance. And I hope to show you a little film. Oh, no. Sorry.
It's goodbye to the old clangers as London's last tram week comes to an end, and they're doing good work to the end. Fares taken on this one go to help the Infantile Paralysis Fund. And here's Ethel Revenell, feathers and all, ready to knock 'em in the Old Kent Road in a grand cause. But here's the last tram just arriving from Woolwich at the New Cross Depot.
Enthusiast user perspectives enable us to tell a different story from this one. In my talk today, I examine one such narrative from the tram enthusiast and activist George Atkins. His 2013 memoir about being a young tram enthusiast in North London just before the Second World War covers the time when the tram lines there closed. Reading Atkins's book raises a question. Can the enthusiast perspective on public transport be considered an act of political resistance, or should it be seen through another lens, such as that of carnivalesque disorder? The film London's Last Tram, which you just saw, uses a jaunty and comical tone. Other documentary film depictions of tram closures from early 1950s London are much more melancholic. It's a funny thing, says the narrator of an 11-minute film called The Elephant Will Never Forget, quotes, but the trams and the rain and the streets of South London seem to belong together. Let's move forward a decade from the 1952 London tram closures to a time when other remaining lines in the UK, such as the tramways of Glasgow, were closing down. A mid-1960s Pathé newsreel film keeps the comic tone, mocking tram enthusiasts while depicting their activities. The model tramway built in his back garden by bus conductor Victor Whitbread and the restoration of old trams at a museum in the English Midlands seem in this film something like absurd curios of the past in the era of colour film and space travel. The film refers to trams, quote, look of clumsy stupidity. But behind its 60s light-heartedness, the perspective taken in the newsreel film account is incredibly condescending. It told audiences from on high that trams belonged in the past. These newsreel films form the best-known archive of images and feelings related to the London tram's disappearance. An account like Atkins's helps us shift our perspective. First of all, it shows us that there was organised resistance to the demise of the tramway. Second, it puts pre-war Britain and a different section of London, the northern one, into focus. Third, it shows us how, far from being merely picturesque festivities, threatening moments of disorder occurred around closure events. This threatening disorder was closely comparable to events in Britain that featured in post-war moral panics, like the scares over, quote, teddy boys in the 1950s, mods and rockers in the 1960s, and football hooligans of the 1970s and 80s. In all of these, groups of working-class males were seen as causing trouble in their leisure time that was not political protest or justified by material lack. All of these moral panics can be connected to the leisure or consumer society of mass prosperity, to which Prime Minister Harold Macmillan alluded in 1957 by claiming that most of our people have never had it so good. Living in Finsbury Park in North London, which is on the map on the right here, Atkins, as a boy and a young man, looked outwards over the web of tramways provided by the post-1933 London Transport tramways, which had taken over the routes of the Metropolitan Electric tramways on the right, connecting where he lived with the points beyond London, the exurbs. As treated by Atkins, violence and carnival were at the heart of the 1938 closures. And, oh look, there's his book popping up. Before getting onto technical matters, he begins his book with a fascinating short memoir. In this, he describes first how he grew up with the trams, using them to visit relatives in other parts of this sector of the vast city and the areas outside it. Then he turns to the night of the 8th of May 1938. That was the date when Wood Green to Enfield routes changed from operation by trams to trolleybuses. The young Atkins, perhaps aged 15 or 16, has journeyed to Wood Green, quotes, to travel on the last tram to Enfield Marketplace. In Wood Green, he meets another young fellow who turns out to be tram activist, promoting the then new magazine Modern Tramways. Atkins then describes the scene at Enfield as the last tram fell prey to souvenir hunters, both those already on the tram and others waiting for it to arrive. All the lights went out. Someone thought it was a good idea to climb out onto the roof, and a number of others followed. I decided to look out and saw some were sitting round the trolley pole and holding onto it. Others were sitting on the roof with their legs over the side, and that is how the tram left Enfield Marketplace very late, escorted by a police car in front and followed by a number of private cars. The police stopped the tram and turned everyone off. I then had to walk back home to Finsbury Park. Passing Wood Green Depot in the early hours, I saw the new trolleybuses lined up, ready to go into service later that morning. Hooliganism combines with festivity here. Damaging the property of the council must have been exciting in the days when the London County Council was a major power in the lives of most. The ending of a tram route could be the occasion for this. Thinking about public space as multiple and contested, the tram's presence on the street, combined with its rail-bound procession-like movement and its municipal symbolism, surely contributed. Atkins leaves it to readers to interpret the disorder at Enfield. What motivated it? Police, tramway staff and suburban property owners no doubt saw the events differently from how they appeared to participants. Alcohol-fueled high spirits, a chance to kick out against authority, or a protest against the closure of tram lines, which, as Atkins shows, were a vital connection linking far-flung family groups. These could all be hypothesised. Atkins, at least, was deeply attached to the North London tramways and genuinely sorry to see them go. After all, he retained these memories of youth throughout his life, spending great amounts of time in later years putting together his history of the Metropolitan Electric tramways and the other operators in this outer sector. The public space of public transport was therefore of profound importance to him and other enthusiasts, and this opens the possibility for us that it was also important to many of the other passengers who missed the trams but did not actually write about them. And now I'm going to hand over to Aleksandra. So thank you for listening.
Hello. We have just heard about past trams, about disappeared trams, but I would like to tell the story about one tram that has never been actually functioning or real, but this tram has been imagined for a few decades already. So on this picture you see Lasnamäe. This is the biggest neighborhood in Tallinn, Estonia, and right in the middle of this neighborhood is a wide 7-kilometer long road, Lagna Road. Now this road connects Lasnamäe with the city center. The road provides bus service and car traffic. However, this road was designed not only for motorized transport, but for the high-speed tram line that was supposed to go right in the middle of this road. For these purposes, for tram tracks, broad space in the middle of Lagna Road was allocated and created. However, the tram has not arrived or has never arrived to Lagna Road and Lasnamäe. Nevertheless, the arrival of the tram has been imagined over a few decades, and I will show some images from different periods of times of how this tram was envisioned. Actually, the idea of the tram in Lasnamäe emerged first way before the Lasnamäe, as we know it now, was designed and constructed. According to the master plan of Tallinn by the Finnish architect L. Saarinen of 1913, the Lasnamäe could be a district with fancy houses, large squares and boulevards, and the district would have been connected with electric tram line. However, these great ideas were not realized because of the coming First World War. Nevertheless, Saarinen's ideas were taken up later in the 1970s when Lasnamäe was actually designed and built. Back then, in the 1970s, architects leading by Mart Port created Lasnamäe as a clusters of multi-story block apartments buildings. And right in the middle, in the heart of this district, there was Lagna Road planned and then built. And in this architectural drawing, we see two tram cars in the middle, which were rushing to the center and back to Lasnamäe. The road, Lagna Road, was built in the end of 1980s, and actually few meters of tram tracks were laid down, but the collapse of Soviet Union put this tram line construction on hold, and this project of the tram line, together with some other facilities in Lasnamäe, remained unfinished or unrealized up till now. Nevertheless, the idea of the tram on Lagna Road persisted through decades, and in following years, there were different images of how it might be looked like. This is the collage from the newspaper of the 1988, showing the possible arrival of the tram in Lasnamäe. This newspaper tells the story about the tram line, and it ends with this poetic line saying that the very presence of the space for the tram tracks on Lagna Road, the very presence of this space inspires us to dream about the future. So, and the people in Lasnamäe continued to dream on in the following decades. This is another collage from the 2005. Back then, the arrival of the tram and the reintroduction of the tram construction was promised by a local politician, and the promise declared that already by 2008, the tram finally arrives in Lasnamäe. It didn't happen. Then in a few years, in 2010, they promised reintroduction of the tram construction again, and it also didn't happen. According to the current study, the construction of the tram line exactly on Lagna Road, it's deemed to be unnecessary because of the existing and very efficient bus service connection. So there are also, in search of alternatives of how to use this space on the road, there is some projects or visualization like this one, showing that possibly this space in Lagna Road, which once were designed for tram tracks, could be used for bicycle lanes. Like see, here you can see the possible way of reusage this space instead of the tram. Well, as artists, we also wanted to contribute to this range of images, and we wanted to contribute in this imagination of the tram and trying to imagine how it would be to travel by the tram on Lagna Road. Last year, we created a temporarily fake tram stop in one of the bridges over Lagna Road. We put a sign saying that this is the tram stop of Lagna tram. And around this tram stop, we were asking people very simple question when the tram arrives. But this simple question actually provokes a lot of interaction and communication. And through this communication, we found out that people who live in Lasnamäe, they still hope for the tram that once was promised to them 40 years ago. We continued working with this imagined tram, and the next project we did in January this year, we wanted to imagine how it would be travel on Lagna Road by the tram, and this imagination we wanted to fulfill through our bodily movement and actually our physical presence right in the middle of the road, on the space which once was decided for the tram, but now it has indefinite status. So I would like to show you the video documentation of the performance we did, but before showing it, I want to conclude my very short talk saying that the trams seems to be a peculiar means of public transport which matter even if they are only imagined.
Okay, so thank you, Aleksandra. It was beautiful to see the film now on a bigger screen. I've only seen it on my laptop, where the skiers are like very tiny, which of course they are also meant to be. Okay, so I will also be chairing the session. So please, if you have any questions or comments, now would be the time. There is one.
London Trams? Does that feature in the narratives that you collect?
Shall I answer here? Yeah, thanks for the question. It has quite an important role. For one thing, it prolonged the trams, actually, so that South London trams, where the tramways hadn't shut down before the war, they carried on operating throughout the war. And then they play an important part in kind of everyday life narratives of South London during the Second World War. And even in this film, The Elephant Will Never Forget, the elephant is actually Elephant and Castle, which is a junction in South London. So the trams are specifically associated with South London there because they survived wartime, and also because it was basically in a much more working class section of London where there wasn't an underground. So it's very interesting, actually. That film, The Elephant Will Never Forget, actually has stuff about, how it was in wartime when the trams started before the all clear stopped for the air raids, and so it really links them to the experience of wartime. Thanks for the question.
Thank you. That was a very good question. Is there one in chat?
Question in the chat, yes. The question is, in the context of disappearing tram lines from other Western European cities and the old cars that are being reused in Europe, in Eastern Europe and beyond, what is the significance of the new tram? And I guess this could be to
Tonio, would you like to take this one?
So the significance of the new tram. Already the question, what is a new tram, is difficult to answer from my insights that I had in these Eastern European cities that I went to, where new trams arrived, which were already 20 years in service in a city like Erfurt in Germany or wherever. So. The significance of the new is already an issue that is discussed, and it is actually, so the point I wanted to make is that the new is maybe a problem in itself, because in the end it needs a lot of time to adapt to the environment, to adapt to the technical know-how that is in place, to adapt to other systems that are involved in the public transport. So I would say the new maybe as something that is giving a new impulse, of course, but also bringing issues to the city. But maybe someone else wants to go.
Well, I can speak from my case of Lagna tram on Lasnamäe in Tallinn. So the case demonstrates that this idea of the tram is alive for a few decades already, although there is a bus service there, and like people who live in this district, they are connected very well with other parts of the city, but nevertheless the idea of having trams somehow survived, and also in interesting why it's so it endures for decades. And when we created this like fake tram stop and talked to people, most of them admitted that traveling by bus it's convenient, it's fast, it works very well, but anyhow people claim that traveling by the tram is more pleasant, which is a bit it's interesting concept why it's more pleasant than traveling by bus or other means of public transport. Then it's sort of like the contribution to the question why trams are better than other means of public transport. This is some maybe sensitive or effective element in this public transport which was to be researched.
Just very quickly on that one about British cities, I think there's this slight danger in the idea of new tram that it gets tied up with city branding and the idea of a tramway as something that's very sort of glossy and presents the city as sort of modern and attractive. That applies to certain British cities such as Edinburgh, where there was a great big controversy over the new tram line that proved incredibly expensive. But in some other cities like Manchester, Greater Manchester, a large tram network has been built in the last 20 years, and then you get it functioning as, if you like, real public transport network rather than a piece of display.
Well, I could add one thing about the Turku possible new trams. One thing that is not maybe much discussed about is class. The old tram served very much factory workers, and that was like one big group that used the tram, but now the new tram, well, there are different lines that are proposed, but some of the new tram lines are more designed for making middle-class people use it on their way to work, so that there is sometimes a very big difference between old and new, even if the places are the same, the people are not. There is one question there, please.
I have two questions, I think. And I was thinking when you were talking about the similarity between subway and tram, in a way it's the same thing, but one is underground and the other one is up above, where we can look at the landscape. But compared to buses and wheels, what do you think about this big difference? Is it a kind of safety? It's the idea of a stable society where we will live in these places, so the tram is a good way of transporting. While the bus somehow implies that everything can change any day because you can make a new route very quickly. You can't do that with a rail. So I would like to hear some of your thoughts on that. But also this thing about underground and in the air. I'm thinking about in Stockholm, they have this big metro system. But the last 10, 15 years, they have built this tram system above the so-called tvärbanan, the cross rail. And it's growing and growing and getting longer and longer, and it's totally popular. So some thoughts about this thing. Thank you. It was very nice to listen to all of you.
Question. So questions about underground, overground, for one thing. I think there's something significant about trams, how they pass through the urban environment visually. So when I look at early 20th century pictures of British tramways, they're often part of kind of municipal branding. So you get the tram going past the town hall and the library or something like that. So it is a kind of public and visual aspect of public transport, whereas of course the metro, you know, in a way the great advantage of it is it's out of sight, it doesn't interfere with the city. And then the other point was versus buses, and I would just say about these kind of video or films from around the closure times in both Turku in Finland and in London, you often have this image from a motor vehicle of coming up to a tram. The tram was then in the middle of the road and it wasn't really separated from the other road traffic, so people would go into the road to get the tram, and there was this sense of it as a kind of obstruction in that era of the internal combustion engine and the idea of kind of automobility being dominant. But that's something of that era, really.
Running out of our time, but as we started a bit late, maybe we can have one more answer to this interesting question.
Two short points. We, on another project, also in the Putspace context, we are looking into rap lyrics on public transport, and there it is interesting to note that, the adjectives that are connected to metros and underground are significantly different to the one of trams. So and this is changing so much. Yeah? Trams a couple of years, decades ago, would also be very much connected to a safety issue, rather a problem for traffic flows and very noisy. And today it has this renaissance of being something very modern and green and a good solution for contemporary life and urban life. Again, back to the same for undergrounds, which used to be a very privileged way to use public transport, and is now in this rap lyrics connected very much to working class, to kind of building a contestation against the city, using the underground as an informal space and so on. Also our youth culture playing out, a lot of violence involved as well. So graffiti culture as a mean for underground that is somehow more connected to these kind of mobility means than to, for instance, a tram that is more of a stage maybe for the city these days. Yeah.
A short point at the end of our section. That's one of the ideas about trams, that they're, so to say, domesticated version of trains. That is like if you like a pet trains, so to say, but they are in the city, and traveling by the tram, you can make a journey also within the city that you usually live, and going from home to work by the tram, it's like a small adventure. That's maybe one of this point that could explain why the tram, they have a special appeal.
When I read through the feedbacks by the citizens, the buses really drove very fast, and there were a lot of complaints, and there still are actually a lot of complaints of buses going too fast. But then again, there were complaints about trams being too slow. So in that way, people are never really satisfied with their conditions. So I want to thank you, our group and our audience for being here, and I hope we got to feed your imagination about traffic and Tramscapes, because it's a very interesting topic. We will now have, well, not a short break, but quite a long break, but please be back at 7 o'clock, because then we have Astrid Swan and Hanna Meretoja, and I'm sure we'll continue with a very interesting program here. Thank you.